The best performer, probably Elvis Presley. I don't think anybody could touch him. I never saw Hank Williams, who was one of my favorites. He died before I ever got to see.
The most lonely, isolated human being I ever met. That is how Johnny Cash, on national television, in November 2002, chose to describe Elvis Presley. Not the king of rock and roll, not the jumpsuit icon, not the punchline he had become in the decades after his death, but a man surrounded, in Cash's own words, by people paid never to say no. Cash said it calmly, without theatrics, sitting across from Larry King on CNN, less than a year before his own death. It was not a rumor. It was not a headline invented for clicks. It was a first-hand account from one of the only people alive who had watched Elvis Presley grow from a terrified teenager into a trapped legend, and it forces a question that documentaries and biographies have circled for decades. What did Johnny Cash actually know about Elvis Presley that the rest of the world didn't? To understand that final television confession, you have to go back nearly 50 years, to a summer night in Memphis before either man was famous. According to the Johnny Cash biography published by the Country Music Hall of Fame and JohnnyCash.com, a 22-year-old former U.S. Air Force Staff Sergeant named Johnny Cash was still finding his footing in music when he crossed paths with a 19-year-old Crown electric truck driver named Elvis Presley. On July 30, 1954, at the Overton Park Shell, an open-air amphitheater that could hold around 4,000 people, Elvis walked out to perform in front of a crowd that had no idea it was witnessing the birth of something enormous. He had just released his first single for Sun Records, That's All Right, a song written and originally recorded by the black blues musician Arthur Big Boy Crudup. Producer Sam Phillips had shaped that early sound using an Ampex 350 tape recorder and a slapback echo technique, according to Sun Studios' own account of the session, a quick, layered repeat that made a single voice sound bigger than it was. The recording was confident. The young man behind it, by multiple contemporary accounts, was anything but. Stories from people who were there describe a performer wrestling with raw nerves, his legs shaking uncontrollably on stage, and a crowd that read that fear as electricity rather than panic. Whether that specific detail happened exactly as legend remembers it is impossible to verify with total certainty. The exact choreography of that night has been retold and reshaped many times over 70 years, and responsible historians treat it as folklore layered onto a real event rather than a precise transcript. What is far better supported is the underlying truth. Elvis Presley was an inexperienced teenager, learning in real time how to survive the kind of fear that could have ended a career before it began. Cash, who spent time around Elvis in that same Memphis scene, never remembered him as fearless. He remembered a gifted, anxious young man carrying far more pressure than his public image would ever admit. That impression deepened the following year, in the fall of 1955, when Cash and Elvis found themselves crammed into a Cadillac Fleetwood, driving from small town to small town across Texas and Arkansas for gigs that barely covered gas money. They played high school gymnasiums in towns like Gladewater, Texas, to crowds that had no concept of what these two young men would become. Cash later described what happened after the shows ended, when the two of them, exhausted and wired at the same time, would sing gospel songs together for hours in the dark, old material like Peace in the Valley, passed down from groups like the Statesman Quartet, led by Hovey Lister. It is a detail historians of the era, including Dr. Michael Bertrand, a professor of history at Tennessee State University who has written extensively on young Southern musicians of the 1950s, point to again and again. An entire generation of rock and roll pioneers carried real religious guilt about the music that was making them famous. For men raised in Pentecostal and Baptist churches across the rural South, rock and roll wasn't just new. To many ears at the time, it sounded dangerous, even sinful. Cash later recalled that Elvis confided in him during those long night drives that he feared his new career might be leading him somewhere he didn't want to go. This wasn't a throwaway line for a magazine profile. It was, by Cash's own account years later, one of the most honest versions of Elvis Presley he ever encountered, not the hip-shaking sensation the cameras loved, but a young man quietly trying to reconcile ambition with the church he grew up in. It is worth being careful here, because this is where legend and documentation tend to blur. We don't have a tape recording of those conversations in the Cadillac. What we have is Cash's own retelling, given consistently across interviews over decades, which is itself a form of evidence, not courtroom-grade proof, but a pattern too consistent to dismiss as invention. That pattern collides with one of the most famous and most misunderstood moments in American music history. December 4, 1956, at Sun Studio on Union Avenue in Memphis. On that afternoon, Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis gathered informally with Sam Phillips while an Ampex 350 reel-to-reel machine happened to be running. The results, later released commercially, became known as the Million Dollar Quartet sessions, roughly 7 to 9 minutes of loose, unplanned music, gospel numbers mixed with covers and half-finished songs, preserved across dozens of tape fragments. Popular retellings of that day often placed Johnny Cash at the piano, trading licks and inside jokes with Elvis. The documented reality, established through surviving session tapes and confirmed by Sun Records historian Colin Escott, is different and, honestly, more interesting. Cash was there at the start of the session, but he left early with his wife, Vivian, to go Christmas shopping. He is not heard performing on the released Million Dollar Quartet recordings. It's a small correction, but it matters because it strips away a comfortable myth, the idea that these men were inseparable, constantly performing together, endlessly documented as a unit, and replaces it with something closer to the truth. They were peers. They were friends. They were shaped by the same Memphis streets, the same gospel records, the same terrifying, thrilling uncertainty of trying to make a living in a brand new kind of music. That is a quieter story than the legend, but it's the one the evidence actually supports. By the mid-1970s, the young men in that Cadillac were unrecognizable from who they had become. Elvis was performing extended residences at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, locked into contracts that kept him on stage night after night, year after year, long after the physical and emotional toll had become visible to anyone paying close attention. Cash, by this point, had already survived his own well-documented battle with amphetamine and barbiturate dependency in the late 1960s, a period he later spoke about openly, crediting June Carter Cash and his own faith with pulling him back from the edge. According to accounts later attributed to Cash by journalist Mikal Gilmore of Rolling Stone, Cash grew deeply concerned about Elvis during this period and reportedly attempted to reach out privately, offering support rather than judgment. Stories have circulated for years that Cash tried to get a personal message to Elvis directly, only for it to be blocked by the tightly controlled management structure surrounding him, a structure built around Colonel Tom Parker, whose business arrangements with Elvis have been scrutinized by historians and journalists for decades. It's important to be honest about the limits of what's confirmed here. The precise fate of any specific letter has never been independently verified through a surviving document, and different retellings over the years vary in detail. What is far better documented, and far more damning on its own, is the environment itself, a business machine built around access, where the people closest to Elvis depended financially on staying close to him and rarely, if ever, told him no. That environment is exactly what Cash chose to describe when he sat down across from Larry King in November 2002, just months after the 25th anniversary of Elvis's death on August 16, 1977. He didn't reach for a single villain or a single tragic flaw. He described a business system, an entourage commonly known as the Memphis Mafia, roughly 15 people whose loyalty was real but whose livelihoods depended on Elvis staying exactly as he was. Cash's phrase, "surrounded by people paid never to say no," is a devastating piece of analysis precisely because it doesn't excuse Elvis of responsibility for his own choices, and it doesn't need to. It simply names the machinery around him, the one that made honest intervention almost structurally impossible. Robert Santelli, executive director of the Grammy Museum, has pointed to Cash as one of the rare people in Elvis's orbit who understood both his talent and the crushing weight surrounding it, having watched it develop from the very beginning rather than arriving after the fame was already fixed in place. Cash also used his public platform to correct a different distortion of Elvis's legacy, the accusation, repeated for decades, that Elvis simply took black music and profited from it without acknowledgement. At the 1992 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, Cash's remarks reflected what he said he had witnessed firsthand during their 1955 tour together, Elvis crediting Arthur "Big Boy" Crudup by name, telling audiences plainly that the song that launched his career belonged to someone else first. That distinction doesn't erase the deeper, more complicated history of how the American music industry profited unevenly from black artists and white performers alike, a reality the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's own historical materials acknowledge. But it does complicate the flattened caricature of Elvis as an unthinking beneficiary of a system he never questioned. Cash remembered a young man who understood, at least in that moment, exactly where his music had come from. In August 2003, 4 weeks before his own death on September 12, Johnny Cash sat in his wheelchair at the Cash Cabin studio in Hendersonville, Tennessee, working with producer Rick Rubin, and gave what would become one of his final extended reflections on Elvis Presley. Discussed afterward in reporting from Rolling Stone's Mikal Gilmore and in Robert Hilburn's later biography, Johnny Cash, The Life. Cash's argument, by every account of those final years, was consistent and unflinching. Elvis's flaws were real, his choices were sometimes indefensible, and the tragedy of his death was not a mystery requiring a villain. But underneath the Las Vegas years, underneath the tabloid headlines and the diminishing health, Cash insisted the frightened, generous kid he met behind the Overton Park Shell in 1954 never fully disappeared. He credited Elvis with absorbing a level of cultural hostility that made space for every artist who came after him, Cash included. Without that leap into the unknown, Cash said more than once, men like himself, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis might have spent their lives exactly where they started, working the same land their families had worked for generations. What Cash left behind, in the end, wasn't a scandal or a secret waiting to be uncovered. It was something quieter and, in some ways, harder to sit with, a 50-year witness statement from a man who watched his friend go from an anxious 19-year-old on a Memphis stage to one of the most isolated famous people in American history, surrounded the entire time by people who profited from his silence. Cash never pretended Elvis was blameless. He simply refused to let the world forget that the boy shaking behind that amphitheater stage in 1954 was as real as the man who died alone in Graceland 23 years later, and that somewhere between those two moments, the people meant to protect him built a wall instead. That is the truth Johnny Cash carried for nearly 5 decades, and the one he made sure, before his own final breath, the world would finally hear.